Okay, not gonna lie, optimism is in short supply right now, and the landscape can feel pretty bleak. Basically, anytime I talk to anyone, something like I need to tune out or it's overwhelming comes up. So, in order to give us the shot of hopium and resilience and fight we need, I am delighted to be joined by Joyce Vance, who's here to talk about her fantastic new book, Giving Up is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping democracy, which is out tomorrow. Joyce needs no introduction, but here's a quick one. She's a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, a professor of practice at the University of Alabama Law School, MSNBC legal analyst, co-host of Sisters-in-Law podcast, author of the Civil Discourse Substack, and today's Strict Scrutiny guest. Welcome to the show, Joyce.
Thank you so much for having me and for that very, very enthusiastic introduction.
So I want to drive home the need for the book and its timeliness, in part by asking you about one of the latest attacks on our system and the rule of law. And that's, of course, the indictment of John Bolton. So could you just quickly share what the indictment is for and why it's so concerning?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. I may have an aberrant view on the indictment of John Bolton because I view it very differently than I view the indictments that were brought against Jim Comey and Letitia James in the Eastern District of Virginia. This new indictment, John Bolton, is out of the District of Maryland. The acting U.S. attorney in that district is a career prosecutor, and she did not go into the grand jury on her own, as did Trump's appointee in the Eastern District to get this indictment. Instead, two senior career prosecutors in her office, joined by lawyers from DOJ's National Security Division, went in and indicted John Bolton. This indictment looks a lot more like the traditional indictment I'm used to seeing in a good case. 20 pages of factual predicate, and if DOJ has the evidence they say they have, then they have a strong case, not an airtight case, not a case that Bolton can't defend against. But this is not a case where you can look at the indictment and say on its face, this indictment was not warranted. You can say that with Comey and with James. And so here's the problem that I think you're driving at. Donald Trump has so compromised public confidence in the integrity of the criminal justice system that people now think, whenever the defendant in a case is somebody that he's targeted, and he has targeted John Bolton outrageously, then people will be uncomfortable. Well, is what's in the complaint, are all of the allegations in the indictment true, right? Can we trust the Justice Department? To me, that's really one of Donald Trump's greatest sins.
Yeah, and I should say, if you want to hear more about this, you should read Joyce's Substack, Civil Discourse, which had a great post about this. But yes, part of what concerns me is I don't know, right, why this case was brought against John Bolton. And I can look at other cases, including that involving David Petraeus, where it looked like, someone who did something similar to John Bolton got much more lenient treatment anyways.
Can we just belabor the Petraeus point for a second?
Yeah.
Because I think it's fascinating. That case was brought during the Obama administration by one of my friends who was one of the North Carolina U.S. attorneys, Ann Tompkins, who handled that case very deftly. Petraeus's conduct was very similar, right? It involved using a shared email account and not a family member like Bolton, but a woman he was having an affair with who was his biographer to share classified information. Petraeus was permitted to plead to a misdemeanor. And that, I think, is the comparison. And something DOJ strives for is uniformity, treat similar cases alike. So what I'll be listening for is whether or not these prosecutors can distinguish this situation from Petraeus and explain why Bolton's conduct is more serious.
Absolutely. So the point you made about Donald Trump kind of defiling our institutions, including the Department of Justice, goes directly to your book, because there is a chapter that is entitled The Myth of Broken Institutions. And it begins this way. In the popular imagination, Donald Trump is invincible. But that's a myth, not a reality. And it goes on to explain how many of our institutions have held. So I agree in many respects. This was especially true during Trump 1.0. I guess I would be curious to hear, how many institutions do you think have held up in Trump 2.0, and how do we communicate to people the imperative of reforming our institutions that might stand in the way of getting us out of this mess, while also not causing people to lose faith and check out from the system?
Yeah, so that question, you've actually just defined the syllabus for my semester-long Democratic Institutions class. I think that this is a really important question. And can I just start by saying it's not a question just for lawyers or politicians. Yes. This is the foundational question as Americans, that we are both capable. You don't have to have gone to law school to understand or be an expert in the institutions. So I think that this is important, sort of like a shared civics education endeavor that we all take part in. What we see, because, we live in a world where the media has to sell whatever it is they're selling, advertising to support their outlets. So we don't hear the good stories as often as we see the cracks, right? The chinks in the armor of democracy are what we see. And so the institutions, when you think about it writ large, you can talk about big letter institutions, the executive branch agencies, Congress, the courts. And so we see where there are problems more readily than we see where there is strength. And because those institutions are made up of people, and that's sort of an ever-changing cast of characters, there's always the opportunity to bolster the institutions. So the institution that's nearest and dearest to my heart is the Justice Department. Mm-hmm. We see so much strength there, right? We see prosecutors who have resigned and walked away rather than doing what they believe is the wrong thing. What we don't see is the thousands of prosecutors across the country who every day keep their heads down, do their jobs, take seriously their obligation to keep their communities safe, and who even as we're speaking, I think are very deliberately confronting what they will do if they are told by political forces to make a decision they disagree with. Look, in my old office, we really hated Washington. I'm just going to be frank. We resented any time folks in D.C. tried to intrude in our decision-making process. At one point, I had a prosecutor in a very sensitive public corruption case. The attorney general had asked for a briefing, and he said, "I'm not going to share my evidence. It might get compromised." And I was like, "Oh, friend, we're going to share our evidence with the Attorney General of the United States." But the point that I'm making is, for prosecutors, this is not a political matter. The idea, no matter who the president is, that he or she would tell you how to handle one of your cases is so foreign to prosecutor DNA. This is a strong institution. It is being tested. Some of the folks at the top are not doing their jobs, but I think we'll see this institution reemerge.
I wanted to put a quick plug in for the book in light of something you said, which is about shared civics education. So I just got back from a trip to LA, and a woman who was a doctor was telling me she has a reading group of her friends, and they are reading the Federalist Papers. Now, this book does a superb job of weaving in some Federalist Papers, some history, but situating it alongside what is happening in our current day. So if you have a reading group like that, this is literally the book for you. And there is, in another chapter, you wrote something that really resonated with me, and that is, quote, "I hope this book has made the case that it's true. The next election is always the most important one of our lives," end quote. This was a great perspective because to me it responds to critiques of, it can't be that like every 4 years, right, you are beating the drums and telling me I need to like put all I can, on the field. And so I guess, was that kind of what you were responding to as you were situating, the energy we all need to have for our democracy?
Yeah, very, very much so. Like every other voter in America, I sort of roll my eyes and take another swig of my drink, whatever it might be at the moment, every time a politician tells me the next election is the most important election of our lives. But we now live in an era where that is profoundly true, right? The midterm elections will determine whether or not we have the ability to reestablish guardrails that will protect democracy. If Democrats, and not even just Democrats, but pro-democracy candidates at every level of government, federal, state, and local, win in this next election, that's a game changer. 2028, the presidential election, it will be a game changer, but also Congress, the Senate, who your governor is. We're seeing that now, right? We're seeing real federalism in play with governors and mayors standing up for democracy too. So yeah, sadly, the next election is always going to be the most important one.
Speaking of, weaving history into current day, the book makes an elegant argument that we are right now facing a new lost cause, and that new lost cause is January 6th. So can you elaborate on this argument and how January 6th has become a new lost cause and what that says about our politics?
Yeah, I mean, I am not a Southerner by birth. I'm a native Angelino, but I have lived in the South for long enough to acquire the accent and to get exposed. So I am not a native Southerner, born and raised in Los Angeles, but I have lived in the South for long enough to acquire the accent and also to absorb some aspects of the cultural understanding of the Confederacy, where it's
Yes.
romanticized and viewed as a sentimental, patriotic lost cause, which is not my view, as someone who has a very different view of slavery. But in any event,
She
that
just went on
persistent
mute.
myth in many ways was permitted to linger because what didn't happen at the end of the Civil War was accountability. Really, Confederate leaders got off relatively light. There was very little in the way of prosecution or jail time. And in the culture, they were resurrected in many ways as heroes. So, fast forward to the modern day, I see a repetition of that with January 6th, where instead of being viewed as insurrection for many people, and for the president, right, who has abundantly pushed this narrative by pardoning people who were convicted for their conduct on January 6th, including exactly, right, as patriots. The Patriots choir that they convened while they were still in custody. And this whole notion that these people who engaged in violence at the Capitol are sort of heroes. I think that that's become a second lost cause, a way of focusing Americans away from true patriotism and the constitutional basis for the Republic onto something much darker.
What part of what is astonishing to me is that the lost cause and redemption took a while for the South to restore itself to a position of power and credibility, whereas January 6th has undergone that transformation in 4 years, which is, again, astonishing. So, part of the book is to underscore that we are the cavalry, and it offers some rules for the cavalry. So, I wanted to ask you about some of my favorite rules, and I was hoping you could elaborate on them. So,
This is my favorite part.
oh, I love it. This is, again, we needed this book on this week in particular after listening to the Supreme Court's Voting Rights Act argument and knowing the court is likely poised to strike a big blow against our democracy. Like, we need to be reminded that it's on us. And even if we have to dig in more, that's what you got to do. Okay, so one of my favorite was be in community. So could you elaborate on that one a little?
One of the great things about being the U.S. Attorney in Birmingham is that you get to spend a lot of time with a lot of different people. And my personal favorite place to go, good Jewish girl that I am, is 16th Street Baptist Church in downtown Birmingham, the site of the bombing that killed 4 young girls during the civil rights era. But my favorite thing about being at 16th Street Baptist Church is the fact that I adore the pastor. We went through Leadership Birmingham together. The music is unbelievably moving. The call and response during church services is great. You have this feeling of warmth and support and of being nurtured and recharging your batteries, and that you can take on the world and sort of right any wrongs. I think that's the feeling that we all need right now. This is a tough moment. I've talked to a lot of people who have said, my temper is frayed. I'm impatient. I had a conversation with a friend who told me a story about being mean to a waitress in a restaurant, which is just not in her DNA. And she was horrified by herself and ended up apologizing. I think that we're all living through that moment and being with other people who are like-minded. Not only do we find support for the actions that we personally want to take to preserve democracy, I think it's just the mental health care that we all need right
Yeah.
now.
I feel that in my bones. I have been explaining to people whenever the question is, how are you? It is more zapped than I ever have been. And I know it is because of what is happening around us. But I think that ties into another one of the rules that I also really appreciated, which is understand that protecting democracy comes in a lot of flavors. And part of what I loved about this is we all find different things taxing and we're all good at different things. And there are so many ways you can contribute to restoring and shoring up our democracy, that this was really a call to figure out like what you can do and how you can find that fight sustainable. So wanted to ask you about that one too.
Yeah, so what motivated me to write this, it's something I think about a lot, right? I mean, I'm a former dancer. I think dance can be a powerful form of protest. One of my students, my democratic institution students, wrote a paper about art and democracy. And working with her on the research, I just kept thinking, this is so powerful. And, I have kids who would never in a million years go out and protest and hold a song, but they would write a short story, or they would engage in, some form of creative artwork, collage, or sort of a group traditional piece. And I think it's really important for us to say to everyone in our communities, there is a space for you to protect democracy, and it has to be authentic for you and who you are and what you care about. So, some people may care about public health and want to work in that area. I think that's fabulous, and we desperately need that. Some people like us are nerdy, traditional legal academics, and, we find this stuff compelling and fascinating, and that's our work. But some people are much more activated by the arts or by religion or by some form of science. I just think it's wonderful to live in a country where we have so much diversity.
Yeah, and just on that art and culture point, I mean, art and culture are oftentimes ahead of law, and they can be really powerful ways of shaping culture in ways that actually lay the groundwork for legal change. I mean, going back to the Lost Cause movement, part of what made the Lost Cause movement successful is the way they depicted the Confederacy in books, in paintings, and whatnot. And so using art and culture to fight for our democracy, that is, right, a very real tool. So one last rule that I'll ask you about, and that is decide who you are and stick to it. So what's behind this rule?
Yeah, so look, I think the problem comes in compromise with the bully, right? I think you've got to just make a decision early on about what you will and what you won't tolerate. If you And this is sort of where we started, right? So many people are overwhelmed by this. They just want to unplug. They don't want to deal. They hate it. They want it to go away. And look, I don't criticize. I think we're all different. We all have different capabilities and situations, and you've got to be who you are. What I fear, though, are people who are, for instance, in government or at the Justice Department who think, okay, I can put up with this one degradation to stay in place and keep doing my job. And that, by the way, may be sort of a legitimate decision, right? I think that there are people that are struggling with that. Maybe I do have to go along a little bit so that I can act as an important barrier when important developments happen. But there are some things that you can't and won't tolerate. And I think where we saw that, frankly, was in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, when it became apparent that leadership at the Justice Department, sponsored from the White House, were going to dismiss the pending prosecution of Mayor Eric Adams on public corruption charges, a strong case. And it was very clear to them that this was politically motivated. And look, you don't dismiss cases against criminal defendants so that they can do the president a political favor. We saw resignations out of that office rather than having those people participate in dismissals. That is knowing who you are, drawing your line in the sand, and at great personal cost, right? Leaving a job that you love for an unknown future where you may well be targeted, because we all understand how MAGA works. But better that you do that than die a death by 1,000 cuts. So I think we just all have to define that line for ourselves.
Well, I think that is a great place to end. And I just want to emphasize again, if you found your local No Kings protest invigorating and you're wondering how to carry that energy forward, then this is the book for you. Again, this is Giving Up is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping democracy. It's not sugarcoating the story, but it will make you feel like we can win this fight. So thank you so much for joining, Joyce.
Thank you for having me.